The Arizona desert stretched out like an ocean of red dust and silence. The sun had begun its slow descent, bleeding gold across the far mesas, and the air shimmered with heat that refused to die, even as the day gave way to dusk. A wooden bench sat beside the abandoned stagecoach station, its roof half collapsed, its windows blind with sand. On that bench, with a leather trunk at her feet and a bonnet that had lost its shape, sat Clara Bennett, a young woman from St. Louis who had gambled everything on a promise that no longer lived. Her gloved hands were folded tightly in her lap. The hem of her travel dress was torn and gray from dust. She had come west believing she would meet Thomas Grady, the man who had written her letters full of talk about marriage, a ranch, and a life under the wide blue sky. He had written of love and forever, words that had kept her warm through the cold Missouri nights. But when her coach reached the outpost near Gila Bend, she learned that Thomas Grady had been shot dead 3 months earlier in a quarrel over land and cattle. Now there was nothing left for her but the wilderness and the long road back east. The stage driver who had brought her this far had gone on ahead to the next stop, promising to send a coach back within the day. That was morning. Now it was near night, and the promise had withered with the light. Clara watched the sun drop lower until it was a red coin slipping into the desert's throat. The air cooled, and the first coyote called from somewhere beyond the dry wash. The sound made her heart tremble. She had grown up where the night was full of church bells and crickets, not this lonely, endless singing of wild things. Her eyes burned from the dust and weariness. She pressed her back against the wooden wall of the station, her bonnet slipping forward as her head drooped. Somewhere in her heart, she told herself that the coach would come, that someone somewhere would keep a promise. But sleep came instead. The desert wind moved softly around her, carrying the scent of sage and faraway rain. The stars began to rise, bright, watchful, eternal, and from the dark ridge above the road, another watcher waited. A tall figure wrapped in a hide coat, his black hair loose upon his shoulders, his eyes reflecting the starlight. He was Talon, a man of the Apache, or half of one. The son of a Chiricahua mother and a white prospector father, he had lived on both sides of a world that belonged to neither. To some he was a ghost rider, a tracker of outlaws, a silent man who appeared and vanished with the wind. He had seen her before, weeks ago, when bandits had held up a stage near Yuma, and he had shot 2 men from the rocks above, scattering the rest. He remembered her eyes then, frightened but proud. Now, seeing her alone and defenseless under the rising moon, he knew what danger stalked the empty land. Coyotes and thieves roamed it alike. He approached quietly, moccasins whispering against the sand. The horses tethered near the corral snorted softly but did not startle. Animals sensed him, understood him. He crouched beside the bench, watching the woman's face in the pale starlight. Dust streaked her cheeks. Her lips were parted slightly, her breath shallow with exhaustion. A strand of hair, pale as the desert moon, had fallen across her brow. For a moment he hesitated. To touch a sleeping white woman was to invite death if anyone saw it. But she would not live through the night if he left her here. He placed a calloused hand lightly on her shoulder. "Señorita," he whispered, his voice low, almost reverent. She stirred faintly, murmuring something he could not catch, then slipped back into the soft weight of sleep. Talon looked up at the stars, then down again at her. He sighed once, the kind of sigh a man gives when he knows trouble will follow whatever mercy he shows, and slid his arms beneath her slight frame. She was light, like a child. Her head fell against his chest as he lifted her. He could smell the faint perfume of her hair beneath the dust, lavender perhaps, though the desert had stolen most of the scent. Carefully he carried her toward the small wagon hidden in the wash below, where 2 horses waited, their flanks dark as wet stone in the starlight. He laid her gently on the pile of blankets inside, covered her with one woven from his mother's loom, red and gold, the pattern of the eagle and the sun. He tied her trunk to the back of the wagon, then climbed to the driver's bench. For a while he just sat there, listening to the stillness. The desert stretched in every direction, endless, merciless, and yet alive with the hum of unseen things. He clicked softly to the horses, and the wagon began to move, wheels creaking, carrying them east toward the canyons. Behind them, the lonely station faded into the dark, its sign creaking once in the wind, a whisper of the life she had left behind. Hours later, The moon rode high, and the road wound through a narrow pass where cliffs rose like sleeping giants. Clara stirred once, turning her face toward the cold night air. Talon glanced back. For an instant, her eyes opened, blue, dazed and afraid. She saw only a shape, a shadow driving through the desert. "Where?" she began, voice hoarse. "Sleep," he said softly. "You are safe." And though she did not know him, though fear still clung to her heart, something in his tone, quiet, steady, certain, drew her back into sleep. By the time dawn came, the red cliffs of the canyon caught the first light. The wagon rolled into a small hollow where a stream whispered over stones, and the air smelled of mesquite and fresh water. Talon stopped the horses, climbed down, and looked to the east where the sky burned pink. He thought of his mother, of her voice telling him that all good deeds carried a cost. "The white world does not thank the brown hand, my son," she had said once. "But do good anyway. The spirits see." He turned toward the wagon. The woman still slept, her face peaceful now, her bonnet fallen beside her. Talon knelt and brushed the dust from her cheek with the back of his hand. "You will wake in light," he murmured. "Not alone." The morning wind moved gently through the canyon, and for the first time in many seasons, the man called Talon felt something stir in his chest, something warm, dangerous, and long forgotten. When Clara Bennett woke, it was to the soft crackle of firewood and the clean scent of mesquite smoke. The first thing she saw was the roof of red stone rising high above her, curved like the arch of a cathedral, sunlight streaming through the canyon's rim. She pushed herself up slowly, blinking against the light. For a moment she did not know where she was. Her bonnet lay beside her on a folded blanket. Around her the ground was smooth sandstone, and nearby a small fire burned in a circle of stones. Beyond that stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, his back to her as he poured water from a kettle into a tin cup. He turned slightly and she saw the sun strike his face, bronze-skinned, hair falling to his shoulders, eyes dark and calm as midnight. Then she remembered the wagon, the moonlight, the shadowed figure lifting her from the desert. Fear tightened her throat. She looked around for her trunk. It sat near the fire, untouched. Her heart eased, though only a little. The man turned toward her, his movements unhurried. "You are alone," he said. His voice was low even. "The night is no place for sleeping." Clara swallowed hard, her fingers clutching the blanket that covered her. "Who are you?" she asked. He handed her the tin cup, steam rising from it. "Talon," he said simply. "Drink. You have been without water too long." She hesitated but took it, the warmth of the cup steadying her trembling hands. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it felt like life itself after the dryness of the desert. "I remember you," she said at last. "The robbery near Yuma, you were there." He nodded once. "Yes, you were in danger then too." Clara looked away, embarrassed. "It seems I have a talent for finding trouble. Or it finds you," he replied quietly. She studied him more closely now. His clothes were plain, a leather coat, a wide belt with a hunting knife at his side, moccasins dusted from travel. He stood with the quiet balance of a man who moved through the world as part of it, not against it. There was nothing of cruelty in his face, only a kind of stillness, as if the desert itself had shaped him. "Where are we?" she asked. "In Red Canyon," he said, glancing toward the high walls glowing in the morning light. "My camp. You will rest here until the next coach road." She hesitated. "You mean to take me back?" "If that is where you wish to go." His calmness unsettled her, not from danger but from the strange safety it carried. She had known many men, merchants, preachers, suitors, but none like this. They were all noise and polish, full of words and wants. This man spoke little, yet every word held weight. When she tried to stand, the world swayed. Talon reached her side in a heartbeat, his hand steadying her elbow. She flinched at his touch, not from fear but from the unfamiliar gentleness of it. "I can manage," she said, her pride flickering like a small flame. He stepped back at once. "You are free," he said. "I mean no harm." The word struck her deeper than he could have known. In a land ruled by men's hands and men's tempers, such restraint was rare. They spent the day beneath the shade of the canyon wall. Talon repaired the harness of one of his horses, his movements methodical, almost meditative. Clara washed the dust from her face at the small stream that wound through the stones. its water cold and clear. When she returned, she found him preparing food, venison strips and cornmeal cooked over the coals. She sat across from him in silence, the only sound the low hum of the fire. After a while, she said, "You live alone here?" He looked up. "Yes, why?" "Because it is easier than living among those who hate what they do not understand." She frowned. "You mean the settlers?" He nodded once. "And the Apache. I am both and neither. My father was white, my mother of the Chiricahua. When the war came, both sides turned from me." Clara felt a pang of shame, though she could not have said why. "That's not right," she murmured. "Right?" He smiled faintly. "There is no right in war. Only those left standing." The fire crackled between them. The canyon walls glowed red, then purple, then sank into dusk. A hawk cried somewhere far above, circling the sky before vanishing into the dark. "Do you still have family?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "No, my mother died when I was a boy. My father was killed for crossing the wrong land. Since then, the desert has been enough." Something in his tone, calm, steady, but hollow at its core, made her throat tighten. She wanted to speak, to say something kind or gentle, but found no words that didn't sound empty. Instead, she watched him stir the fire, the orange light flickering across the planes of his face. As night deepened, he brought out his blanket, the same crimson and gold weave that had covered her in the wagon, and spread it near the fire. "You will sleep here," he said, "and you?" He pointed toward the wagon. "There. The night belongs to no one, but I will watch it." She hesitated, guilt pricking her heart. "You don't have to keep guard." His eyes met hers, dark, unwavering. "A man who forgets to guard the night soon forgets to wake." The desert wind whispered through the canyon as she lay down beneath the blanket. For a long time she watched the fire, listening to the soft crackle and the distant call of a coyote. She thought of her journey, the long train from St. Louis, the letter that had led her into emptiness, the man beside the fire who had carried her from the edge of death without asking her name. "Talon?" she said softly. He looked over, his profile outlined in firelight. "You should have left me there," she murmured. "It would have been easier." He studied her for a moment, then turned back to the flames. "Maybe," he said, "but some things are not for easy." There was silence after that, deep and comfortable, like the desert itself had paused to listen. Clara closed her eyes and the sound of the fire faded into the rhythm of her breathing. Talon sat for hours, unmoving. He watched the moon rise, silvering the canyon walls, and thought about the strangeness of fate. He had not meant to find her, nor to care what became of her. Yet here she was, and the thought of her waking alone again filled him with a quiet ache he had not felt in years. When dawn came, soft and pale, Clara awoke to the smell of coffee again. Talon was already saddling the horses. She rose and folded the blanket, her movements slow but sure. He looked up briefly. "You are stronger today." "Thanks to you," she said. He gave a faint shrug. "Thanks to rest. We move when the sun clears the rim. I will take you to the coach road by noon." She felt an unexpected sadness at his words. The idea of leaving this canyon, this strange, quiet refuge, filled her with a loss she couldn't name. But she only nodded. "As you wish." The horses snorted softly as he tied down her trunk once more. Then he turned to her, offering a hand to help her climb into the wagon. For a moment she looked at that hand, rough, scarred, strong, then placed her own within it. When their fingers touched, something unspoken passed between them. Not a promise, not yet love, but the faint recognition of two souls who had both wandered too long in their own deserts. By mid-morning, the canyon began to waken, sunlight spilling down the red walls, turning every grain of sand to fire. Clara sat in the back of the wagon, the motion rocking her gently as they followed the narrow trail that wound eastward. Talon guided the horses in silence, his eyes always scanning the ridges above. It was a strange silence, not awkward, not cold, but vast, like the desert itself. In it, Clara found a peace she hadn't known since leaving home. The creak of the wheels, the rhythmic clop of hooves, and the faint rustle of her dress against the seat seemed to blend into the steady heartbeat of the land. She watched the horizon, great slabs of stone rising like fortresses, brush trembling in the wind. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Talon glanced back, his expression unreadable. The desert gives nothing for free. What it shows you, it can take away. She smiled faintly. Still, I think I'd rather see it than hide from it. For a moment, something like warmth flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by that familiar stillness. He said nothing more, and the wagon rolled on. As noon neared, they stopped by a dry riverbed where a trickle of water still moved beneath the sand. Talon knelt, dug into the earth with his hands until clear water pooled up. He filled the canteens while Clara gathered her courage to ask the question that had been sitting heavy on her heart. "You could have left me at that station," she said. "You could have gone your way." He paused, the sunlight glinting on his hair. "Yes." "Then why didn't you?" Talon wiped his hands and looked out across the desert. For a long time he did not answer. Then quietly he said, "Once I found a man dying in the sand, a prospector, white like your people. I gave him water. He lived long enough to tell others an Apache had attacked him. I was hunted for months. I learned then that mercy is its own punishment." Clara's breath caught. "Then why?" "Because I saw your eyes," he interrupted softly. "You had not yet given up." She didn't know what to say. There was no reply worthy of that kind of truth. They traveled on until the sun burned low again. The wind picked up sharp and hot, and Talon's gaze kept shifting toward the west. "Storm coming," he muttered. "We'll make for the old mines before it reaches us." The air thickened with dust. By the time they reached the abandoned shack, the sky had turned to copper, the wind howling like a living thing. Talon led the horses into a narrow cut between rocks, then pulled the wagon close to the structure. A single-room cabin, its roof sagging, but still standing. "Inside," he ordered. Clara obeyed without argument. The storm broke soon after, a wall of sand slamming against the boards the sky swallowed in red and gray. The wind screamed through every crack, rattling the walls. Talon set a fire in the hearth and closed the door tight. They huddled near the flames, listening to the fury outside. The light danced over the rough walls, over her pale face and his dark, solemn eyes. "How long will it last?" she asked. "Maybe hours, maybe all night." She tried to smile, though her voice trembled. "I used to think the prairie winds back home were fierce. I didn't know what wind truly was until I came here." Talon sat across from her, silent for a long time. Then he said, "The wind here is a spirit. It cleans the land. Takes what is weak. Do you think it takes people too?" He looked into the fire. "Only those who stop fighting." The room filled with a softer quiet after that. The kind of quiet that comes when two souls recognize something in one another. Not yet love, not yet trust, but a shared weariness of the world's cruelty. Hours passed. The wind's rage dulled to a hum like distant surf. Talon mended a broken bridle by firelight, his hands steady. Clara watched him, her thoughts drifting. He was a mystery, a man born between worlds, carrying both and belonging to neither. There was sadness in him, but not bitterness. And when he moved, there was grace, the kind born not of gentility, but of survival. She realized then how little she had known of strength before. The men she'd grown up around had worn fine coats, boasted loudly of honor and courage. Yet this man, quiet and alone, seemed carved from something older, purer, as if the desert itself had shaped his heart. "You speak little," she said at last. "Don't you ever tire of silence?" Talon's eyes met hers. "Silence is where truth lives. Words are what men use to hide it." She looked down, a faint smile touching her lips. "Then maybe that's why you frighten me. You don't hide anything." He turned back to the fire. "And you?" he asked. "What are you hiding?" Clara's smile faded. "A life that doesn't exist anymore. A promise that died before I arrived." He didn't press her further, only nodded once, as if he understood more than she'd said. Outside, the storm gave a final cry and fell silent. Talon rose, opened the door a crack, and looked out. The desert was washed clean, the air cool, the stars returning one by one. He stepped aside and let the fresh wind sweep through. Clara stood beside him, the firelight painting their shadows on the floor. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He nodded. "After the storm, the land always is." She turned toward him, her heart thudding in her chest. "Do you ever wish you could leave this place? Go east, maybe. Start over." Talon's jaw tightened. "The east would not have me. The west barely does." "That's not true." He looked at her then, a long, searching look that felt like it stripped the air from the room. "It is true," he said quietly. "You just haven't seen how deep hate runs in the blood of men." Clara swallowed hard. "Maybe not all men." He said nothing more, but the corner of his mouth curved. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. Later, as the fire burned low, Clara lay wrapped in his mother's blanket, the one of crimson and gold. Talon sat near the door, his rifle across his knees, the night silent but for the crackle of embers. She watched him through half-closed eyes, her mind adrift. There was comfort in knowing he was there, not as a guard, but as something steadier, truer. And as she drifted toward sleep, she thought of how strange fate was, that a woman who had come west seeking a man's promise now found safety in the company of another who had never spoken one. Outside, the desert stretched endless and wide. Beneath the stars and in that vast loneliness, two hearts began quietly to change. By the time the wagon reached the border town of Dos Caballos, the sun hung like a white coin in a cloudless sky. Dust lay thick on the road, rising in lazy spirals behind the wheels. Clara sat straight-backed in the wagon, bonnet tied tight, the brim shadowing her eyes. Beside her, Talon guided the horses with a firm hand, his gaze never leaving the horizon ahead. Dos Caballos was little more than a handful of buildings clustered along the stage line. A saloon, a feed store, a jailhouse, and a few weather-beaten homes. The smell of hot iron and horse sweat hung heavy in the air. Men lounged in the shade, their hats low, their eyes sharp. As the wagon rolled into town, the chatter on the boardwalk thinned. Every head turned. Clara felt it. The stares, the sudden stillness. She looked at Talon, who seemed unchanged, his face calm and unreadable, as though he had walked through 100 such silences before. They stopped before the stage office. A man in a bowler hat came out, a ledger tucked under his arm. He took one look at Talon and his expression hardened. "You lost, friend?" the man asked, his tone edged with something cold. Talon didn't flinch. "Looking for the eastbound coach," he said evenly. The clerk's eyes flicked to Clara, then back to Talon. "Coach won't be here for 3 days, but the lady's welcome to wait at Mrs. Harlan's boarding house. He let the word hang, his meaning clear. "You best camp outside town." Clara's spine stiffened. "He's with me," she said firmly. The clerk's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am, that may be, but folks around here don't take kindly to—" "That'll do," she snapped, the sharpness of her voice surprising even herself. The man blinked, caught off guard, then muttered something and disappeared back inside. Talon turned to her, his tone quiet. "You should stay here. I'll be nearby." "I won't," she said, her voice still hard. "If they don't want you, they don't get me." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once, not in agreement, but in quiet understanding. Together they drove the wagon out of town, past the last fence to where a lone cottonwood tree spread its branches beside a shallow creek. There, they made camp. The horses drank deeply, and Clara unpacked a small satchel from her trunk. The town's noise drifted faintly through the air, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the distant laughter from the saloon, but out here, it all felt far away. She sat by the creek, washing the dust from her face, the cool water running over her fingers. "They looked at you as if you were something less than a man," she said quietly. "I am used to it," he replied. "You shouldn't have to be." Talon shrugged. "The world does not ask what it should be. It is what it is." She turned to look at him. Really look. The sun caught his profile, carving light along the line of his jaw, the strength in his shoulders. "You don't belong in their world," she said. "You belong to the land." He gave a small, humorless smile. "The land doesn't belong to me either. It just tolerates me, Same as men do. Clara felt a strange ache at his words. There was too much truth in them. She thought of her own life, of the polite society back east where everything was measured by lineage and wealth, where her dreams had been tied to a man who was now buried in dry earth. Perhaps she had never belonged there either. As dusk settled, Talon built a small fire. The cottonwood's leaves whispered in the breeze and the smell of sage drifted on the air. They ate in silence. Bread, a little dried meat, and coffee brewed over the coals. After a time, Clara spoke. "Talon," she said softly, "when this coach comes, and I go back east, and what will you do?" He poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks drift upward. "Keep riding. There's always another trail. And no one waiting for you?" He shook his head. "No one." Her voice faltered. "Then maybe you shouldn't ride so far." He looked at her, a long, steady gaze that seemed to see more than she meant to say. "You would not want my road, Clara Bennett." "Maybe I would," she whispered. "Maybe your road is the only one that feels real anymore." For a while, neither spoke. The stars came out, sharp and bright, filling the sky. The fire crackled low, painting them both in amber light. "You should sleep," he said at last. She nodded, though her heart was restless. "Will you stay close?" He gave a quiet nod. "I will not leave." She lay down beneath the blanket, but sleep came slow. She could hear the murmur of the creek, the faint sound of Talon's movements as he tended the horses. Above, the stars turned slowly across the heavens. Sometime after midnight, she sat up. He was still awake, sitting by the fire, head bowed slightly, the light tracing the curve of his cheek. She rose and went to him. For a moment, he didn't notice. Then he looked up, startled by her nearness. "You should rest," he said softly. "I can't," she whispered. "When I close my eyes, I see faces, the people in that town. The way they looked at you, the way they looked at us." Talon's voice was gentle. "They only see what they have been taught to fear." "And what do you see when you look at me?" He hesitated. The fire popped, throwing a shower of sparks into the air. "I see a woman who has not yet decided who she is." Her breath caught. "And you? Who are you?" "A man who stopped asking long ago." Something in his tone, weary, honest, broke the distance between them. Without thinking, she reached for his hand. It was rough, scarred, but warm. He did not pull away. For a long time they sat like that, two shadows joined by firelight, saying nothing, needing no words. When the dawn came, the sky bloomed in golden rose. The town bells rang faintly across the flats, calling men to work and women to prayer. Clara stood beside her luggage once more, just as she had days before. But the woman who stood there now was no longer the same. The stagecoach rattled into view, dust rising behind it. The driver pulled the reins, calling out, "Eastbound." "Room for one." Clara turned to Talon. He stood beside the wagon, still and silent. His expression gave nothing away, but his eyes, dark and deep, held the kind of sorrow that words could not hide. "This is your road," he said quietly. "Not mine." She looked toward the coach, then back at him. "Maybe both our roads meet right here." He opened his mouth to reply, but she was already moving, past the trunk, past the fire, straight to him. Her hand found his face, her thumb brushing the scar on his cheek. "You carried me when I was lost," she said softly. "Maybe you're meant to carry me farther." For a heartbeat, the world went still. The horses, the wind, even the desert itself seemed to hold its breath. Then slowly, Talon took her hand in both of his. The coach driver cleared his throat behind them. "Miss, we're ready to leave." But Clara didn't move. At last she turned and said, "No, sir. I have another way to go." The driver frowned, muttered something, and drove off, the coach disappearing in a cloud of dust. Clara and Talon stood alone again, the wind brushing between them. She smiled faintly. "Well," she said, "seems the world has made up its mind for us." He looked at her, that slow, unreadable look she had come to know, and for the first time, she saw warmth in it. "Maybe so," he said. The sun climbed higher, and together they began packing the wagon. The road ahead was long, uncertain, but as the horses moved forward and the town fell behind them, Clara knew one truth clear as the rising light. She had come west to find a man's promise, but instead she had found her own. The sun had only begun to rise when they left the edge of Dos Caballos behind them. The town's crooked rooftops dwindled into the horizon, swallowed by the shimmer of morning heat. Ahead stretched the open land, miles of sage and redstone, the road winding like a scar through the wilderness. Talon drove the wagon in silence. The reins rested loose in his hands, his eyes on the trail ahead. Clara sat beside him, her bonnet resting on her lap, her hair catching the wind. For the first time since leaving St. Louis, she felt no weight pressing on her chest. They rode for miles before she spoke. "You would have let me go," she said quietly. "Yes, even if it hurt you." Talon nodded once. "A caged bird can't sing. You deserve to choose your sky." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe I've chosen the right one." The road narrowed as it climbed into the foothills. The air cooled, carrying the smell of pine. They stopped near a spring that bubbled up clear from the rocks. Talon let the horses drink while Clara knelt by the water, cupping her hands to drink. Her reflection trembled on the surface. Wind-blown hair, eyes rimmed with dust but shining with something new. When she looked up, Talon was watching her. "What?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "You've changed, have I? You smile like you belong to the wind now." She laughed, a small, honest sound. "Maybe I do." He turned away, busying himself with the horses. But the curve of his mouth betrayed the faintest hint of a smile. By noon, they reached the high plateau where the world seemed to stretch forever. The wagon moved slow over the uneven ground, wheels crunching against dry grass and stone. In the distance, a herd of wild mustangs ran across the plain, manes flying, hooves drumming the earth like thunder. Clara leaned forward, eyes wide. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "They're free," Talon said. "That's why." She watched them until they vanished beyond a rise. "Were you ever like them?" He looked toward the horizon. "Once, before the world taught me to hide." The air grew quiet again. Only the creak of the wagon and the cry of a distant hawk broke the stillness. Clara thought about what he'd said about hiding, about being caught between two worlds. She understood now how lonely that road must have been. "Talon," she said after a long while, "if you could go anywhere at all, then where would you go?" He considered the question, the way only a man of few words could. "There's a valley north of here," he said finally, "between two rivers. My mother called it the Valley of the Dawn. She said the first light of the world touched it before anywhere else. I've never seen it." She turned to him, eyes soft. "Then let's go there." He blinked. "Why?" "Because it's yours," she said simply. "And because I want to see what the world looked like when it began." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right." The wagon turned north. They traveled for days through country few dared to cross, red mesas giving way to rolling grasslands, then to pine forests where deer watched from the shadows. The nights were cool and silent. They slept by small fires. The stars spread thick above them. Each evening, Clara would listen as Talon spoke in the soft, rhythmic words of his mother's tongue. Sometimes he told her what they meant, prayers to the wind, the sun, the earth. Other times he said nothing at all, and she would lie beside him, eyes tracing the slow arc of the Milky Way until sleep claimed her. One night, as the fire burned low, Clara reached out and took his hand. "When you speak like that," she said, "it sounds as if you're part of the sky." Talon smiled faintly. "Maybe I am. My people believed a man's soul was borrowed from the stars. When he dies, it returns to them." "Then you'll never be lost," she whispered. He turned his gaze toward her, the firelight warm in his eyes. "Not if you're beside me." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of unspoken promises, of the kind of understanding words could never hold. By the 5th day, they reached the valley. It was just as he had described, vast and green, split by two clear rivers that met like strands of silver in the sun. The air smelled of wildflowers and rain. Mountains rose on every side, their peaks crowned in snow. Clara stood at the edge of a ridge, her skirts brushing the tall grass. "It's like Eden," she breathed. Talon dismounted and came to stand beside her. "This is where my mother dreamed of peace," he said quietly. "A place where no one hunts, no one hides." She turned to him. "And now you've found it." He shook his head slowly. "We found it." The wind moved through the grass, whispering around them. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, though she didn't know why. It was as if the world itself had opened its heart and let her in. They made camp by the river. Talon built a small shelter from pine branches, and Clara unpacked what few things she owned: a shawl, a book of psalms, a silver brooch her mother had given her. As the sun fell, she lit a small lantern and set it beside the stream. The light rippled across the water, golden and trembling. Talon watched her from across the fire. "Why do you do that?" he asked. "My mother used to say light keeps the spirits close," she said softly. "Maybe it keeps the living close too." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll keep it burning." They sat side by side as the stars rose. For a long time neither spoke. The night was vast, the silence holy. Then at last Clara reached for him. Her hand found his cheek. "When I first came west," she said, "I thought I was chasing love. But it wasn't love I was looking for. It was a place where my heart could rest." He took her hand in his, pressing it gently to his chest. "Then rest here," he said, and under the western sky she did. The days that followed unfolded like pages of a quiet dream. They built a home from what the land offered: stone, timber, and patience. The horses grazed free. The river sang them to sleep each night. Sometimes they rode out together across the ridges, the wind in their hair, the sun on their faces. Other times they sat by the fire in silence, saying nothing, needing nothing. Clara learned the names of the stars. Talon learned the sound of her laughter. There were no letters now. No promises written on paper, only the steady rhythm of life shared between them, day by day, heartbeat by heartbeat. One evening, as the sun sank low, painting the valley in amber light, Clara turned to him and smiled. "Do you ever think," she asked, "that all of this began the moment you lifted me into your wagon?" He looked out across the valley, the corners of his mouth curving faintly. "No," he said. "It began the moment you didn't ask me to put you down." She laughed softly, resting her head against his shoulder. "Then we're both to blame." He smiled, wrapping his arm around her. The light faded, the sky deepened to purple, and the first stars appeared above the mountains. There, in the valley of the dawn, where the rivers met and the world seemed new again, the woman who once sat beside her luggage waiting for a promise found one that needed no words. And when the night wind passed over them, carrying the scent of rain and cedar, it seemed to whisper the story of two souls, one from the east, one from the endless west, and who had found, at last, that love was not a place to reach, but a road to walk together beneath the eternal sky.